Okay. All righty. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome to A Culture of Accessibility Through Policy and Communication, part of a series of online presentations brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. I'm Laura Garapi. I'm the chair of the committee, and I'll be introducing our presenter today, and we'll also be joined by my colleague, Alex Deek, who's a member of the Professional Development Committee as well, and he'll be helping to collate and send questions forward to our presenter throughout the presentation, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And thanks so much to Gina Parsons-Diamond from ACRL for being here to make sure we're all good to go on the technical front today. As you just heard, this session is being recorded, and when the recording's ready, we will send the link to the video to everyone who registered for the program. So even if you know of colleagues who registered but weren't ultimately able to make it today, they will have access to that. Throughout the presentation, we will have opportunities built in. Angie will invite you to ask some questions along the way and preserve a few chunks of time for that. You'll want to use the chat box to push those forward. And so Angie can focus on presenting. Alex will be collating those questions and passing them to Angie when the time comes for each of those question breaks. So as Gina said, please do make sure you're choosing the all panelists and attendees option when you put a chat forward. At the end of the program, we'll post a link to a program assessment in the chat box after the Q&A. We'd appreciate you taking a few moments to give us your feedback on today's program. Okay, with those announcements out of the way, I'm very happy to start today's program. And our presenter today is Angie Brunk. Angie's an experienced public service librarian who's nearing the completion of her MAS in Human Factors and Usability Testing. So think user experience design there. And she's been specializing in accessibility. She's taught basic graphic design courses for communications majors and incorporated basic graphic design into her practice as a librarian. She's published conference proceedings and presentations on various aspects of accessibility in libraries, and recent projects include accessibility audits for a library software vendor and a museum. In addition to being born with a visual impairment, she's served on disability services advisory boards at 3 universities and worked with numerous students with disabilities. She's currently an instruction librarian at Missouri Western State University, and we are so delighted to have her here to share her expertise with us today. So at this point, I will turn it over to Angie. Thank you, Angie.
Cool. Thank you, Laura, and thank you for that introduction. So, ooh, something's not right here. Okay, that'll work. So a bit about me. Laura actually covered pretty much all of what I was going to say about myself. So this is very personal for me. This isn't an abstract concept. I have encountered barriers, in the profession and in life. So this is very important to me on a personal level as well as a professional level. So why policy and communication? What exactly am I trying to do here? First, I want to say that, I'm very aware that libraries and librarians have very different levels of control and input into things like policy and public communication. I've worked at libraries where we had full control, and it was basically, as long as it's not illegal, hey, have at it, to, having to go through several committees and the university council to get anything approved. So I understand that we're all coming from very different levels of freedom and levels of control. And institutions all have very different levels of accessibility and inclusion, from grudging compliance to really trying to take things to the next level and not just do the minimum, but actually make a warm and welcoming environment for people with disabilities. So either a policy, an FAQ, or even internal communication allows your library to convey values of inclusivity and accessibility, and to have handy and easily accessible information that's critical for people with disabilities that want to use your facility. Some of you might already be doing everything I'm going to talk about. For some of you, some of this might be new. And, in the interest of transparency, a little bit about where I'm coming from, I really struggled with the idea of breadth versus depth. And I decided on breadth because of the nature of the presentation. I have covered accessibility for instruction and web design in depth in a couple of other places, and those are probably my areas of biggest interest, along with accessible graphic design. And I'm happy to share more information. So this is delivered from a fairly high level. I'm trying to be long on big ideas that hopefully you can take something away and think about, what can I do in my library to make things better? Versus it's pretty short on specific in detailed advice. It just doesn't work for this format. However, I am more than happy to advise other librarians, either detailed discussions about your situation or pointing to appropriate resources, whichever works. A lot of people are tempted to think that the larger institution is taking care of this, and I really hope they are, because, in the US at least, it's kind of the law. But as we know with a lot of other things at universities, whether it's, our web presence or facilities policies, libraries have some unique needs that might not be covered as well. We serve community visitors and outside scholars. We're open more hours than other facilities on campus. My personal pet interest, library instruction has some unique challenges when dealing with student accommodations and universal design for learning. We might not be informed that there's a student with a disability in our classes, and if you plan the wrong activity, that can cause some real issues. And it's even possible, I don't think it's very likely, but it is possible, that a student might not be registered with disability services, but might need accommodations in the library, or at least some understanding. So if you take nothing else away from this, I want you to take away the idea that the library should be somehow actively engaged with questions of accessibility and inclusion in your library at whatever level you can. Whatever you can do, even if it's only taking notes for yourself, because maybe you work in an environment that isn't as, shall we say, up to date on the issue as they should be. Even if it's only taking notes for yourself and, doing things on the down low, whatever you can do, just please do it, because we really have a long ways to go still for full inclusion and accessibility. Let's talk about a few basic cultural competencies. And obviously I'm going to be oversimplifying things. There are actually several models of disability. I'm just going to touch on a couple briefly to try to illustrate where we are in current thinking about disability and accessibility. A lot of people, either consciously or unconsciously, carry around the medical model with them still. And the medical model is all about fixing the person. What piece of equipment can I give you to make you appear normal? How can I fix you so that you can be as normal as possible? And it tends to emphasize function over dignity. And that can be unfortunate. Whereas a social justice model, and this is the model that I think most closely mirrors libraries' values, looks at fixing the barrier. So, and if you can't fix the barrier, how do you at least provide equitable access in as similar a way as possible? Function, self-determination, and dignity all matter. And I think they really do. It is an example of how a common problem will be handled under the two different models. One thing I face quite often is I walk into something like, say, a fast food restaurant, and the menu board, or the only available menu, is plastered to the wall above my head. And if I can see it, I can't see it until I get up to the cash register. Most of the time, I can't even see it then. And if you're looking at things from the medical model, then having either someone who's with me or a store employee read the menu to me is an adequate solution. Well, it's not. First of all, it's humiliating. I mean, obviously I kind of like this reading thing, so having someone else do that for me is extremely humiliating and frustrating. And not to mention, it's very inefficient time-wise. it forces me to disclose my disability in a way that I don't necessarily want to, and that draws attention to me in a way that's very unflattering. Whereas with the social justice model, there's actually a fairly simple solution, which is to provide a handheld, high contrast print menu. Even if I am blind or to the point where I need to use a screen reader, at least then I can use my own assistive technology in a way that's discreet and allows me to look at things on my own terms as opposed to somebody else's terms. Language, especially when it comes to policy and or public communication, can be quite controversial. In fact, in the US, there's quite a debate within the disability community itself about language. The current standard is person first. That is, you would say a person who is visually impaired or a person who uses a wheelchair. Identity first language is things like deaf, wheelchair user, amputee. I think in the end, it's likely that identity first language is going to win out in the US. It has in other developed nations. In the meantime, person first is probably better for formal communication, just because that is still kind of expected, but I do expect that to change at some point in the near future. So a little bit about who uses accessible technology and why. Screen readers are one of the things that people think of first when you hear accessible technology. And they're actually used by a fairly wide variety of people. And in fact, not everyone who uses a screen reader is blind or even significantly visually impaired. Some people with disabilities such as dyslexia or ADHD find screen readers very useful. Some people have neurological conditions that make reading for prolonged periods of time very painful and difficult, and they might use a screen reader for longer passages. So it's entirely possible to have someone who navigates a website both sighted and using a screen reader, as well as, of course, the more obvious example of someone with a significant visual impairment. I personally use magnification, and the nice thing is that most modern web browsers, operating systems, word processing software have tools for screen readers and magnification built in. Some people need to look at things at an alternative color space, such as white on black, either for reasons of visual impairment, or again, sometimes people with disabilities find a different color scheme much easier to use, or alternative pointing devices, usually for people with musculoskeletal issues. So do we have any questions at this point?
Hey, Angie, there is one question out there.
Okay.
And it is, can you explain what identity first and why it will win out in the US?
Okay. So identity first has actually already won out among at least one community, and that is the deaf community. There are people within the disability community who believe that person first language is considered somewhat ableist, and it is admittedly kind of awkward. I mean, when I'm referring to myself casually, I usually say I'm visually impaired. I don't say I have a visual impairment. You know, I assume that when you're talking to me, you're aware that I'm a person. I have, you know, witnessed other incidents where I feel like not using person first can be objectifying, but the consensus within the disability community seems to be moving towards identity first, because it should go without saying that we're people. And, you know, I think person first definitely served a purpose and sadly was very necessary, but I hope that maybe we're moving away from that. As someone in one of the disability studies groups on Facebook put it when discussing this language, because person with an amputation sounds so much better than amputee, said no one ever. Does that answer the question, I hope? And was that the only question, Alex?
Yes, so far that's the only question.
Okay.
That's come through.
So let's get started with a little bit about, how can you talk to staff and kind of get the ball rolling in your library. My first suggestion is to make accessibility part of one person's portfolio. Like anything else, if you make it everybody's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility, and it's harder to get things done. It's harder to hold people accountable. So it should be just keeping track of accessibility issues should be part of one person's portfolio. They should be informed about anything accessibility related in the library, even if they're not responsible for fixing the problem. Somebody tells the webmaster, hey, students who use magnification are reporting problems with this page on the library, you need to fix it. The person who's in charge still needs to be informed so they at least know what's going on. A single contact point is going to make it easier for people to express concerns and to keep an eye out for possible patterns, to broadly have that responsibility of staying informed on accessibility issues. It also makes it easier to have a single contact point as a liaison for your Office of Disability Services, Accessibility Resource Center, whatever your university calls it, or any relevant committees at the university. And in most cases, you will find those offices and committees are happy to have someone to work with and who is interested in working on these goals. So I'd recommend some basic staff training for all public-facing staff. And, however you do training at your library, whether it's watching videos, meetings, having people read a few things, just some basic information on disability etiquette. And there are quite a few resources out there. If there were one thing I was going to say about disability etiquette, it should be that, you treat people with disabilities as much the same as you would anybody else. Don't assume that a student who wanders in the library, who rolls in a wheelchair and looks a little confused, is necessarily looking for the accessible workstation. Treat them as you would any other person who looks confused and ask what they want rather than assuming. Know the technology, especially the assistive technology that's available in your library. A lot of campuses are moving towards campus-wide subscriptions to Read and Write Gold. And if your campus has that, see about getting that on your library computers if it's not already there. And, hopefully that person who's in charge of accessibility can spend some time playing with it and learning about it. And there are a lot of tools in that suite that are useful for everybody, not just people with disabilities. But it does include things like magnification, a screen reader, and masking and blocking software, which are very useful as adaptive technology. Where are the accessible workstations in your library? How do they work? Is it a crank? Is it a switch? Know where the fully accessible restrooms are. Are there any places in your library that are not fully accessible? We all have, well, some of us at least, have older buildings that very well might have parts that are grandfathered in, so to speak. Is that the case in your library, and what is or is not accessible? Have your staff undergo some basic training about the assistive technology. Who uses it? What is it? Why do people use it? Reference, which is of course one of my favorite areas. Know your people. Does anyone know ASL, or is anybody particularly good at communicating with deaf students and really adept at chat or something like that? Does anyone personally use assistive technology? Know who might be a better choice to help a student with any particular issue, just like you are aware of which of your colleagues are most expert in certain subject areas. Try to get some idea of the student body. How many students on your campus have disabilities? What kind of disabilities do they have, and what sort of adaptive technology is most often used on your campus? The same sort of demographic information that you would collect in terms of, Do you serve a lot of minority students? Do you serve a lot of students who are first generation, or a lot of students who are perhaps economically disadvantaged? And think about what the reference staff can do to prepare to meet their needs, like you would with any other demographic category. Instruction, which is really, really my baby here. So, make the decision, if you haven't already, to adopt universal design for learning practices in your instruction program. Do all of your librarians know how to adapt an active learning activity for students with disabilities? There is some information about universal design for learning available. I've addressed this in a couple of other papers. Things like, when you design a scavenger hunt, do you know how to get to all of the things on the scavenger hunt? Do you know how to create an accessible route for your library tours that allows a student who uses a wheelchair, who maybe can't use the stairs, to integrate with dignity and grace when you've taken everybody else up the stairs and they need to use the elevator? Again, it's all about, how do I make the student feel comfortable? How do I make sure that they do not feel singled out? One of the reasons that I think this is so important is because instruction is often really library marketing. We might not like to talk about it that way, but it's sometimes the first introduction a student has to a library. And if you do something like, metaphorically speaking, put the only available menu up where a student with a visual impairment can't see it, you've alienated that student and you've shown them that they're not welcome and they don't matter at the library. So, when you're designing instruction activities, especially some of these active learning activities, which can be great for engagement, but if you're not ready to adapt, you can actually end up alienating a student. And it's important to note that you aren't necessarily going to know if you're going to have a student with, say, a visual impairment, or a student who might have muscle coordination issues or something like that in the library. And professors who need to accommodate students in class are not told by their Office of Disability Services what the student's particular impairment is. That is need-to-know information, and basically not considered any of the professor's business. They might have some idea and the student might self-disclose, but the professor will simply be told what the accommodation is, and whether or not you even get that information, which I often don't in library instruction situations, it might not help you adapt the activity. So there are some ways, like emailing the class beforehand, just to ask if anybody has any concerns, or describe activities that you're planning and see if anybody has any concerns or would not feel comfortable with that activity. So if you're planning outreach events, whether that's a game night or a party or whatever, just try to make sure that you are accommodating all students as much as possible. Have a variety of activities. Make sure that, you don't plan all activities that would require sight or hearing or strong muscle coordination or the ability to walk and dance freely. Make sure that there is a variety. Have the contact information for your accessibility person on all publicity for the events. Consider doing active outreach to students with disabilities, again, through the offices on campus. Most students with disabilities are happy to know that someone cares, and they will give you ideas for activities. They might even say, oh, that's cool. If you're doing a game night, why don't we bring our blind ball and play a game of blind ball or something like that? Just ask. Most people are quite willing to talk, and especially if this is an effort towards inclusion. From a design perspective, you need to make sure that everything you're producing is accessible and follows the design standards. apparently this one isn't obvious because a few universities have been sued, but please just, I don't care how quickly done the video was, don't release a video without closed captioning. There is probably an office for learning technology. At this university, it's called the Instructional Media Center, that has access to software and or services to close caption things. So even if you think this video is only for one class, please don't release it without closed captioning it. Make your signage as accessible as possible, but also make sure that critical information is available in different formats. Someone who knows that they might encounter obstacles in your building is likely to look for information on your website to figure out what they need to know before they go there. Have some kind of plan in place in case someone requires extra assistance with wayfinding. You know, how are you going to maybe juggle things at the circulation desk if you have a student who is either blind or maybe can't fit their wheelchair through certain areas of the library? Make sure you have a plan in place for all of these situations. Okay, do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, Angie, we have a couple questions that came through. So
Okay.
the first one is, when you say how many students with disabilities on your campus, would that be those known to disability services, and would you include those who declare learning disabilities for the purpose of classroom and test accommodations?
Okay, so that is more or less what I mean. Like I said, it's possible that there are students with disabilities who have not registered. Until I was a graduate student at this university, I didn't register because I never had real problems in my classes. I was always able to negotiate things on my own. And the one thing I really needed help with at Indiana University, which was wayfinding, their Office of Disability Services wouldn't do. So yeah, I can easily imagine situations where you would have students with disabilities who aren't registered, although the offices are trying to get better about doing outreach and making sure everyone's registered. So that would be a good place to start. And yes, I do include students with learning disabilities because they use adaptive technology, and they might find that they need certain assistance at the library that maybe they didn't realize until they get there. Okay, and you said there were a couple questions?
Yeah, so then we have another one asking, we have asked our school's administration before whether there are students with any particular disabilities in our first year class, so we can be sure to create, or first year class, so we can be sure to create an accessible version of a new orientation program. We were told they could not give us such information because of privacy. At a small school, less than 1,000, how can we be prepared?
Oh, that's an excellent question. My undergraduate is actually from a small school less than 1,000. And I found that you could not keep the fact that you have a disability quiet. I mean, that's just the nature of these smaller institutions. It's kind of strange that they couldn't. Now, I can understand that they would not give you specific student information for privacy's sake, but they should have been able to give you general information like, yes, we have several students with visual impairment. We have some deaf students who will have an interpreter with them during class. So they should have been able to give you some basic information, but there does remain a lot of confusion about what the law allows and what the law demands. I would start by creating a program that is as universal as possible. And that's something that, just contact me because that's a long answer. I will refer you to one of my earlier papers that I did with Dale Minobe when I was at Emporia State University, which is I think we've titled it The Kid Who Is Blind, but the presentation was Don't Make the Blind Kid Play Dodgeball. And yes, that was based on personal experience. So there are good tools out there, and just try to make your program as universal as possible so that you're prepared when those students show up that you're not expecting. were there any other questions, Alex?
There are a couple others. Do we have enough time for another one or two, Angie, do you think? Or?
I think I can go through the rest fairly quickly, so go ahead.
Okay. So here's one that came through. I teach a lot of online workshops. How can I make those accessible for people who typically rely on closed captioning?
Okay, so the YouTube closed captioning is a decent place to start. Those will need to be edited, but if you are uploading videos to YouTube, YouTube does have automatic closed captioning. Your IMC or our Instructional Media Center, whatever they call it at your institution, probably sends those videos out to a service, because you can actually have things closed captioned for about $1 a minute with 24-hour turnaround, which is not bad at all and fits within institutional budgets. So I would talk to that office on your campus, because they probably already have some kind of service in place. If nothing else, at least the automatic YouTube captions would be something. And was there another one?
Well, I think they were referring more to live workshops.
Oh, to live workshops. Ooh, that's a good one. There are some live transcriptioning services, but but those do tend to be more expensive. I would offer a robust outline of your workshop ahead of time to any student who relies on closed captioning, so that they can at least get an idea of what's going on and ask you questions. And you should also be able to meet with, again, your disability services person on campus and see what they recommend as well, because they probably have some tools in place that you might not know about. And that's all I can say for now, because each situation is going to be a little different there.
Great. Then we have two more. So
Okay.
one is, what is wayfinding, just to define what wayfinding is?
So wayfinding is dealing with physical reality, like actually finding your way physically in the space. Like, how do I get to the reference desk? How do I find the stacks? Things like that.
Perfect. That leads into our next question is, how do you make signage more accessible?
The first thing to do is to think about what's really essential to have on the sign. And I've seen too many signs that try to convey too much information, and it's just cluttered. So, and then from there, you have to think about whether your end goal is to make something that's pretty or something that people can actually see. So the highest contrast, a readable font, and as large a font as possible. That doesn't mean that you can't use color. It just means that it needs to be high contrast, and that your graphic elements need to not interfere with the information on the sign. Just because you can do it in Canva or InDesign doesn't mean you should. But that's my 5-second elevator speech answer to that one, if that helps.
Great. So that's all the questions we have right now.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the information that I want you to provide. And this is, whether you can do it through a policy, through an FAQ, or if you're really restricted and all you can do is internal documentation, go with that. Whatever you can do, the information that's going to be necessary to allow someone with a disability to more easily and functionally use your library. So let's talk a bit about physical reality. Are there any publicly accessible areas of your library that are grandfathered in? If there are, make sure that that is documented, whether it's an FAQ, statement on your website, whatever. How are you going to provide access to someone who cannot physically get to the space? And, again, spell this information out. Think about how are you going to assist students who cannot physically remove a book from the shelves or can't see well enough to do so. Do you want to send maybe a circulation student to the stacks with the student? Or do you just want the student to wait while somebody retrieves the books? I don't think that there is a right answer in that case. I think it depends a lot on the philosophy of your library and what and how you are trying to teach students. You know, neither answer is perfect. If you want the student to accompany your student worker to the stacks, that still kind of marks them out, and it's admittedly kind of a waste of their time. But if you just have them waiting at the circulation desk, that still kind of marks them out. There's no perfect answer, but it's just think about how you're going to do it and have a consistent approach. So how can people even get to you? Do you know where is the nearest accessible parking spot to your library, and where's the nearest van accessible parking spot? From that parking spot, how is somebody going to physically navigate to your library? What's the most wheelchair-friendly route and library entrance? Are there any entrances that are problematic for wheelchair users, or that might be problematic for other reasons, like somebody, you have a door that's really heavy to open and doesn't have an assist button? Are any of the routes into the library problematic for other reasons, like it's poorly lit, the pavement's unusually uneven, the door opens in a really awkward way? You know, how is somebody physically going to get there and have some information available to people who might not be able to do what you assume other humans can do? What's the most wheelchair-friendly route to get to your circulation and reference desks or single service point, whatever you have? What other problems are people going to encounter? Maybe your monumental staircase is not very contrasty, and this is something I run into all the time. There, at my current institution, one building has beautiful midnight blue stairs, but the light is such that if you have no depth perception, there's no contrast there, and I don't even try to go down those stairs. I feel like it would be dangerous for me. I might go up them, but down them, not happening. So, you know, do you have a staircase that maybe it's hard to see the difference between the rise and the run of the stairs? Or poorly lit. The lobby might contain movable furniture, you know, which is great for the students. We do want to encourage them to use the space to make it their own and to, you know, configure things in a way that's useful for them. However, if they just leave things scattered all around, that might mean that there's no accessible path for someone who uses a wheelchair. You know, are your stone steps often slippery? Or for somebody with sensory issues, or for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, a very noisy lobby can be an issue. It doesn't mean that these are things that you have to run right out and fix. There are laws, and, you know, I'm sure your university has a plan for dealing with this, but at least be aware of it so that you can advise someone who might need to know this. Think about your environment. You know, for people who are hard of hearing, have learning disabilities, or sensory processing issues, information about noise levels could be really, really vital. What are the various noise levels in your library? Like, for example, you know, is the first floor kind of your casual workspace, noisy floor, and then it gets quieter as you go up in the building? Or are there certain reading rooms that are noisy, certain ones that are quiet? You know, where can somebody find a quiet space if they need it? What should they do if a quiet zone is noisy? Is there any place in the library where I can escape this horrible, horrible fluorescent lighting? For those of us who get migraines, this can be a real issue. Is there any place that maybe has softer, gentler lighting? Is that something you could add? What is the most accessible route to all the publicly accessible parts of your library? How is somebody going to get to special collections, your local history room, whatever, you know, your microfilm room? What's the most wheelchair-friendly, accessible route to all of those places? Can I take things, can things out of the display case be taken out for closer inspection? What alternative format materials are available in your library? What kind of ebooks do you have? Can those ebooks be read Now, of course, you can't know the answer to every one of your ebooks, but you should know how to find out the answer so that you can help someone find as much material in accessible formats as possible. You know, how accessible are your stacks? What provisions do you have in place to retrieve difficult to access material? On your digital presence, I think it's a really good idea to have a formal statement about accessibility on all of your digital assets. What standard does your website conform to? And that answer should be WCAG 2.0 at the AA level. You know, are you using any special accessibility features such as ARIA tags? How accessible are the outside materials that the library purchases? How can someone alert you to a problem with an outside vendor? Our vendors do try, but they are not perfect, and there have certainly been problems with screen readers and PDF compatibility. There are copyright issues surrounding audiobooks versus ebooks, so that can make it difficult for someone who uses a screen reader to access some of our ebooks actually. You know, if you happen to know that your website works best with a certain accessibility tool as opposed to another, then provide that information. And who should they report concerns to? If somebody's having a problem accessing your website or your digital library, who can help fix the problem? And I think one of the questions that's often overlooked but is really important, because you know, we all bring our own experiences to the library, whether it's, you know, our cultural background, our economic background, our geographic background. We all bring our own unique perspectives, and we're not going to effectively serve our students with disabilities if we're neglecting things on the staff side. So think about whether or not your library is friendly to staff with disabilities and what you could do to improve that situation. Do your position descriptions or job descriptions create barriers, or do they send a message of non-welcome to potential staff members? I can't drive because of my visual impairment, and unfortunately the state of Missouri took away my broom license even. Apparently I was like hitting endangered owls on night flights or something. So seeing that driver's license requirement, which I have seen in far too many librarian job descriptions, whether you are willing to accommodate or not, that sends a message that I am not welcome, that people with disabilities are not welcome. And there's actually a whole host of problems that can keep somebody from driving that might have nothing to do with their job performance. I don't know, I always laugh at this one. I don't know how many reference librarian job descriptions that I have seen that require peripheral vision. Never had it, done just fine as a reference librarian for 15 years. You know, or get very descriptive about walk, stand, sit, push, pull, lift. Are these things really required to do the job? And does this really need to be in the job description, or could you find a way to accommodate someone? Because the more language you have that seems to exclude people, the less likely people with disabilities are going to be to apply for your job. So, you know, next time you're hiring, really think about that job. Could you accommodate with someone with disabilities? What kind of disabilities could you accommodate? I mean, I understand that an instruction librarian who uses a screen reader might present some insurmountable obstacles. And you do only have to make reasonable accommodations for a job, but that person could probably do other jobs in your library. So think about, what are you doing to make sure that you're ready to accommodate people to the maximum degree possible to allow and encourage people with disabilities to apply for jobs at your library? So do I have any questions at this point before I get to my final thoughts?
We do have one question that just came in,
Okay.
which is, We use WCAG 2.0 AA. Any particular questions or red flags to look for when reviewing VPATs from vendors?
Ah, okay. That is a complicated question. I would say, look for whether or not your vendor is actually using ARIA tags. What standard do they claim to conform to? Do they use language that suggests that they actually know what they're talking about? Or did they just have some intern fill out a VPAT without really thinking about it? I mean, that's probably the only answer I can give in the space we have. I'm sorry, that's probably not adequate, but I hope it helps. Or is there any follow-up to that, Alex?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
So that helps was the.
Oh, okay. Good. So basically, my final thoughts are a plea that, whatever you can do to be active, engaged with this problem, please do it. I know that, every institution is different. You have to deal with different institutional cultures, but usually there's something you can do. Anything that you can do, no matter how small, is going to help. But we're a long way from solving this problem. I mean, the underemployment rate for individuals with disability is still astronomically high. On average, it's about a 30% unemployment rate. For people who are blind or visually impaired, it's much higher, with some advocates saying as high as 80%. So obviously we have a long ways to go before we can say that we've actually integrated people with disabilities into society. So whatever we can do in our own small sphere, please do it. And, advocate in your community, in the library, in your university, just what can I do to make things better? And for more detailed questions, because I know that this is pretty superficial, unfortunately, that's kind of what you can do in an hour webinar, please do not hesitate to contact me. I have a couple of my emails up there and my website as well. Although my website needs a little work. What is it they say about the cobbler's children? But otherwise, thank you for attending. I hope that you have found something valuable that you can take from this. And please let me know if there are more questions, because I feel guilty about letting people go a little early, but I was hoping there'd be more questions.
Yeah, we did just get two that came in.
Okay.
So one of them is, since you just talked about job ads and librarians with disabilities, any comments on how a librarian with disabilities should approach applying for a library job?
First of all, I think you have to be authentic to what feels right to you. And it took me a lot of time to come to understand things as I do now and to approach things as I do now. I used to hope desperately that I could just pass, as it were. But then I realized that, I have strabismus and nystagmus, which you probably can't see here, but my eyes basically are constantly doing this, and they're crossed. And while it doesn't bother me, I don't even notice it. My brain just says, whatever. Unfortunately, other people do notice, and they sometimes judge you very negatively because of it. And I got to the point where I realized that, I think it was after someone who saw me in an airport asked if I was on drugs, where I realized that people were going to make judgments about me, and I needed to take some control of the information and how I presented myself. And so I just started disclosing, even in my cover letters. And lately, with a lot of libraries pushing for diversity initiatives and pushing for inclusion and asking explicitly about diversity in their job ads, I've just decided, well, there is a way that I provide a little diversity, so I'm just going to address that right in my cover letter. If you're not comfortable with that, one of the things I did earlier before I got more comfortable with self-disclosure was, when we got to the phone interview stage, I would ask about public transportation and walkability, because yeah, some of that information is available online, but that is information that really is much better with local knowledge. You know, yeah, your bus system might look great on paper, but it turns out, oh, yeah, the buses are always broken down. They're never on time. It's just not reliable. Okay, that's information I need to know. You know, is that something then the library can work with, or does that make it impossible to work there? So you first have to explore what you want and what you are comfortable with. I've decided in the end, I'm much more comfortable with disclosure, but that has its own risks. Okay, were there other questions, Alex?
I think that was, we did have one more. It was more of a, I couldn't tell if it was a comment or a question, but sometimes the question is, sometimes we like to place a standing poster or card of seasonal materials, example given Christmas music in high traffic areas, but I've been hesitant to do so because of the issue of obstruction for a student or faculty member with visual impairment. That's the comment or question.
Well, I may or may not have done damage to a few things like that. But anyway, you know, as long as there is clearance and there is a way for somebody to feel that with their cane and it's fairly large, you know, as long as there are still clear paths to where they need to go, but do think carefully about your placement and about how can I make this as visible as possible and as easy to find with a white cane as possible. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you found something useful here.
Thank you so much, Angie, and I'll just jump back in and say thank you again to everyone for attending. Thank you, Alex, for collating questions throughout the presentation. Several of you have already seen me posting a link to the program assessment. If you don't mind taking a moment to fill that out, we'd be grateful. I just plopped it in there one more time. Most of all, thank you again to Angie so much. Really interesting. I found myself jotting things down along the way. And please stay tuned, those of you who have attended, for listserv communication and social media from ACRL ULS about our future presentations. Thank you all. Have a good one.